Once upon a time, there was a young boy named Galileo. He was a curious lad with a mop of unruly hair and eyes that sparkled with mischief. Galileo had many wonderful qualities, but he had one terrible habit. He simply refused to go to bed at a reasonable hour. While other children in his village were tucked up snug in their beds, Galileo would be wide awake, peering out of his window at the starry night sky. His parents had tried everything to get him to sleep. They'd read him bedtime stories, sung lullabies, and even threatened to take away his favorite toys. But nothing worked. Galileo was determined to stay awake as long as he possibly could. He thought sleep was a waste of time. There were so many exciting things to do in the dark. Every night, when the house fell silent, Galileo would tiptoe out of his room. He'd creep down the creaky stairs, careful not to wake his snoring parents. Then he'd slip out the back door and into the moonlit garden. Here, he'd have all sorts of adventures. He'd chase fireflies, dig for buried treasure, and try to catch the elusive night fairies he was sure lived at the bottom of the garden. Galileo thought he was terribly clever, outsmarting everyone and having the whole night to himself. But he didn't realize that his late-night escapades were taking a toll on his young body. His eyes were always puffy and red in the morning. His skin was becoming pale and dull, and worst of all, tiny red spots were beginning to appear on his face. But Galileo didn't care about any of that. He was having far too much fun to worry about a few silly spots. One particularly moonlit night, as Galileo was busy trying to catch a particularly fat frog by the pond, something extraordinary happened. There was a sudden flash of light, like a star had fallen from the sky. Galileo blinked, and when he opened his eyes, he saw the most peculiar sight. Standing before him was a tiny woman, no taller than his hand, with wings that sparkled like diamonds. "Who are you?" Galileo gasped, his eyes wide with wonder. The tiny woman huffed, putting her hands on her hips. "I'm Pimpla. Your fairy godmother, of course," she said in a voice that sounded like tinkling bells. "And I'm here because you, young man, are in desperate need of some guidance." Galileo couldn't believe his eyes. He'd always dreamed of meeting a fairy, but he'd never imagined one quite like this. Pimpla was a sight to behold. Her skin was as smooth as porcelain, without a blemish in sight. Her hair was a cascade of silver that seemed to float around her head like a halo. She wore a dress made of what looked like rose petals, and on her feet were the tiniest glass slippers Galileo had ever seen. But what caught his attention most was the glowing wand she held in her hand. It pulsed with a soft pink light that made Galileo feel warm and sleepy. "Now listen here, Galileo," Pimpla said, fluttering closer to his face. "I've been watching you, and I'm not happy with what I see. Do you know what happens to little boys who don't get enough sleep?" Galileo shook his head, suddenly feeling a bit nervous. Pimpla's eyes narrowed. "They get pimples," she declared. "Nasty, red, painful pimples all over their faces." Galileo's hand flew to his cheek where he could feel the small bumps that had been bothering him lately. Could it be true? Were his late nights really causing these spots? Galileo listened wide-eyed as Pimpla explained the importance of sleep. She told him how his body needed rest to grow strong and healthy. She described how sleep helped his brain remember all the things he learned during the day, and most importantly, she emphasized how a good night's sleep kept his skin clear and pimple-free. Galileo nodded along, promising to go to bed early from now on. But as soon as Pimpla disappeared in a shower of sparkles, Galileo's promise was forgotten. The night was still young, and he wasn't tired at all. He decided to explore a part of the garden he'd never been to before. As he pushed through some tall bushes, he found himself in a small clearing, and there, right in the middle, was the most enormous beehive he'd ever seen. Galileo's mouth watered at the thought of all that sweet golden honey. He knew he shouldn't disturb the bees, especially at night, but the temptation was too strong. He looked around, making sure Pimpla wasn't watching. Then, quick as a flash, he darted toward the hive. He reached out his hand, ready to scoop up a handful of that delicious honey. Just as his fingers touched the sticky sweetness, Galileo heard an ominous buzzing. It started softly at first, but quickly grew louder and angrier. Before he could pull his hand away, the air around him was filled with furious bees. They swarmed around his head, their tiny wings beating furiously. Galileo let out a yelp of surprise and fear. He'd made a terrible mistake, and now he was going to pay for it. Section 4. The Buzzing Consequence. The bees were relentless in their attack. They dive-bombed Galileo's face, stinging him on his cheeks, forehead, and even his eyelids. Galeo screamed and swatted at the air, but it was no use. There were simply too many of them. He turned and ran, crashing through the bushes and back towards his house. The angry swarm followed him all the way, continuing their assault. By the time Galeo reached his back door, his face felt like it was on fire. It was swollen and throbbing, and he could barely see out of his puffy eyes. He burst into the kitchen, waking his parents with his cries of pain. They were shocked to find their son out of bed at such an hour, and even more horrified by the state of his face. They quickly applied soothing cream and gave him medicine to help with the pain and swelling. As Galeo lay in bed, feeling miserable and sore, he couldn't help but think about Pimpla's warning. She had told him that lack of sleep would give him pimples, but this was so much worse. His entire face was covered in red, swollen lumps. Some were from the bee stings, but others, well, they looked suspiciously like the pimples Pimpla had warned him about. The next morning, Galeo could barely recognize himself in the mirror. His face was a mess of red, angry bumps. Some were clearly bee stings, but others were unmistakably pimples. They were sore and itchy, and no amount of cream seemed to make them go away. Galeo felt terrible. Not only was he in pain, but he looked awful too. He couldn't bear the thought of his friends seeing him like this. For the first time in his life, Galeo wished he had just gone to bed when he was told to. Section 5: Pimples, Pain, and a Lesson Learned. For the next few days, Galeo was confined to his bed. His parents were worried about his swollen face and wanted to make sure he got plenty of rest. At first, Galeo was frustrated. He hated being stuck inside when there were so many exciting things to do. But as the days passed, he began to notice something strange. The more he slept, the better he felt. His bee stings started to heal, the swelling going down little by little. But more surprisingly, the pimples that had appeared on his face began to fade too. Galeo watched in amazement as his skin slowly cleared up. By the end of the week, his face was almost back to normal. He couldn't believe the difference a few good nights' sleep had made. One night, as Galeo was getting ready for bed, at a reasonable hour for once, he heard a familiar tinkling sound. He turned around to see Pimpla hovering by his window, a knowing smile on her face. "Well, well," she said, her eyes twinkling. "It looks like someone has finally learned their lesson." Galeo nodded sheepishly. He apologized for not listening to her before and thanked her for trying to warn him. Pimpla waved her wand, and a shower of sparkles fell over Galeo's bed. "Remember," she said, "beauty sleep isn't just a saying. It's real magic. Your body does its best healing while you're asleep. So, if you want to stay healthy, strong, and pimple-free, make sure you get plenty of rest." With that, she disappeared in a flash of light, leaving Galeo to ponder her words as he drifted off to sleep. Section 6: The Importance of Beauty Sleep. From that day forward, Galeo became a changed boy. He still loved adventures and exploring, but he learned to do these things during the day. When night fell, he was always the first one in bed, eager to get his beauty sleep. His parents were amazed at the transformation. Not only was Galeo more obedient, but he was also happier and healthier than ever before. Galeo's friends noticed the change too. His skin was clear and glowing, and he always seemed to have boundless energy. When they asked him his secret, Galeo would just smile and say, "It's all about getting enough sleep." Some of his friends were skeptical at first, but when they saw how well it worked for Galeo, they decided to try it for themselves. Soon, the whole village was talking about the importance of a good night's sleep. Parents found it easier to get their children to bed on time, and everyone seemed to be in a better mood. Even the local doctor noticed a decrease in patients complaining about skin problems and fatigue. Galeo felt proud that he had played a part in spreading this important message. As for Pimpla, she continued to watch over Galeo, though he rarely saw her anymore. She didn't need to intervene now that he had learned his lesson. But sometimes, on quiet nights, Galeo would look out his window just before going to sleep and catch a glimpse of sparkles in the moonlight. And he would smile, knowing that his fairy godmother was still there, making sure all the children in the village got their much-needed beauty sleep. And so, the Legend of Pimples became a bedtime story, reminding children everywhere about the magical power of a good night's rest.